July 2, 1943. Over the Tyrrhenian Sea, the air trembles with engine vibration at 20,000 feet. Below, a box formation of B-24 bombers crawls toward targets in southern Italy. If the escort breaks away today, even briefly, the math is brutal and immediate. Fighters will punch through. Bombers will burn. Crews will not come back. There is no margin left in daylight bombing, only repetition and loss. The escort on the wings was never supposed to be here. They came from a training field in Alabama that existed apart from the rest of the Army Air Forces, fenced off by policy as much as by geography. Their path into cockpits was slowed by paperwork, delayed by shortages, and shadowed by reports written before they ever flew. The system had already decided what they could not do. Every check ride was a test of more than skill. Every mistake counted twice. Every success was treated as provisional. When the war widened and bomber losses began to threaten the strategy itself, necessity pushed against certainty. Long-range escort was the missing piece. Fighters had to stay with bombers all the way to the target and back, resisting the temptation to chase. It was unglamorous work, measured not by victories, but by absence, by what did not happen. And so the orders came down, careful and conditional, assigning that task to the men of the Tuskegee Airmen. They arrived in theater late and under watch. Aircraft came in batches that lagged behind other groups. Early on, they flew P-40s, then P-47s, machines that demanded discipline in fuel management and punished inattention at altitude. Later came the P-51, its range finally matching the job. The rules were explicit. Stay with the bombers. Do not roam. Do not leave gaps. Do not turn the escort into a hunt. At altitude, the cold pressed through gloves and seams. Oxygen hissed steadily. The engine's note never varied enough to offer relief. Hours passed with nothing but formation keeping and the slow tightening in the chest that came from waiting. German fighters showed themselves as glints and dots, testing for a pull-away, for a moment of impatience. The escort held position. When attacks came, they were met and then broken off, the priority always the same: return to the box. There was no room for speeches in the cockpit, only calculation. Fuel gauges were checked again and again. Ammunition was conserved. Damaged aircraft were shepherded. The work asked for restraint when instinct argued otherwise. It asked for endurance when fatigue narrowed attention and the body wanted movement, any movement, to release it. Losses still happened. Aircraft failed. Men were shot down. The sky did not bend for anyone, but patterns shifted. Bombers that once limped home alone now arrived with escorts intact. Missions that used to end with missing crews ended with holes in wings and engines that had made it back. It showed up not as praise, but as numbers in after-action reports, as columns that no longer spiked. By 1944, the tempo hardened, routes stretched deeper, enemy resistance thickened around targets, escorts pushed fuel to the edge, sometimes landing with gauges reading nothing they could trust. Some diverted, some bellied in on unfamiliar strips. The pressure did not lift. It accumulated, sortie by sortie, because the job was never to finish the war, but to keep the next formation alive. There was a moment when the choice narrowed to one path. Either the escort held through another run, or the losses would force a retreat from daylight altogether. The flights went up anyway. They stayed anyway. The system did not announce a change of mind. It simply kept issuing orders. When the war ended, the accounting was quiet. Percentages, totals, comparisons that did not support the old claims. No ceremony accompanied the rewriting of rules. Bases emptied, uniforms were turned in. Some stayed in aviation under a different structure, many did not. The air over the Tyrrhenian Sea is empty now. What remains is the record of days when failure meant catastrophe, and the escort that was told to stay did. The days that followed did not soften. They compressed. Missions stacked without pause, weather closing in, maintenance crews working by feel under dim lights, hands numb from cold metal. Pilots slept in fragments, waking with the taste of oxygen still in their mouths. Briefings were stripped to essentials, routes, altitudes, expected resistance. There was no space left for argument, only for compliance. Over northern Italy and into Germany, the escorts flew into air that felt crowded even before the enemy appeared. Flak rose in patterned bursts, black and methodical, forcing bombers to hold steady through it. The fighters stayed close enough to see pieces tear away, close enough to watch crews signal damage through glass and motion. When interceptors came in head-on, closing speeds erased reaction time. Attacks were brief, violent, then gone. The escorts regrouped and returned to position, the box still intact. Fatigue made judgment thin. Long missions dulled edges. The temptation to chase never disappeared. It had to be suppressed every time. Staying meant accepting that there would be no visible proof of success, only the absence of disaster. It meant breaking off when advantage appeared, because the formation needed coverage more than the sky needed another wreck. There were mornings when aircraft were grounded for reasons that never appeared in orders. There were inspections that took longer than others. None of it was stated. The pressure remained indirect, bureaucratic, quiet. Performance was still being watched, measured against a standard that shifted without notice. The margin for error stayed narrow. And yet the work continued to show itself in the returns. Bomb groups requested the same escort again. Not formally, not in writing that carried weight, but through patterns that could not be ignored. Assignments repeated, pairings held. The escort that stayed was kept. Late in the campaign, damage accumulated everywhere. Engines ran rough. Control surfaces responded slowly. Pilots flew aircraft they knew had only one more mission in them. Weather closed routes and opened others with little warning. On those days, decisions were reduced to minutes and miles. Turn back and leave bombers short. Press on and trust fuel that should not last. The formations went forward. The escorts went with them. When the last missions ended, there was no sense of release in the way people imagine it. Just a sudden stop. Engines cooled, aircraft were parked, reports were filed. The numbers were complete enough to stand on their own. They did not argue, they did not accuse. They simply recorded that the task had been done as ordered, under conditions that were never adjusted to make it easier. In the months after, changes came without acknowledgement. Units were reorganized, barriers lifted without apology. What had been unthinkable before the pressure of war became procedural afterward. There were no corrections issued for the past, only new directives, written as if the old ones had never existed. Time moved on. Airfields were reclaimed by grass. The routes faded from charts. What remained were the missions logged, the bombers that landed instead of disappearing, and the quiet fact that when the war demanded endurance and restraint over spectacle, the escort that was told it could not fly had already been doing the work. After demobilization, the paperwork moved faster than memory. Squadrons were disbanded, aircraft reassigned or scrapped, records boxed and shelved. Pilots returned to cities and towns that had followed the war at a distance, through headlines and casualty lists. What they had done in the air did not translate cleanly on the ground. There were no parades waiting for precision, no language for restraint, only questions that did not quite fit the answers. Some applied to continue flying and were turned away without explanation. Others were accepted under new rules that pretended the old ones had never existed. The transition was uneven and quiet. There was no single order that marked the end of separation, only a sequence of revisions that slowly made it harder to defend. The war had forced a contradiction into the open, and the institution resolved it the only way it knew how, by moving forward and leaving the inconsistency behind. In archives, the numbers remained stable: escort loss rates, bomber survival percentages. Mission counts that showed consistency under pressure. They were not dramatic figures. They did not announce themselves. They simply refused to support the claims that had once been treated as fact. Over time, those claims stopped appearing in official language. They were replaced by neutral terms, by standardized expectations, by silence. The air war itself became history, then abstraction. Engines that once shook the sky were reduced to footage without sound, to photographs without cold. The experience narrowed to fragments: a formation holding through flak, an escort sliding back into position, a damaged bomber staying airborne long enough to cross water. The work was there if someone looked for it. It did not insist on attention. What remains is not a legend, but a record of constraint, of orders followed precisely when deviation would have been easier, of pressure applied not once, but daily, without release, of a role defined by staying, by refusing the visible outcome in favor of the necessary one. In the end, they were allowed to fly not because belief changed, but because circumstances removed alternatives. And when the war demanded endurance over display, presence over pursuit, the task was carried out until it no longer needed to be argued for at all. Years passed before the distance made the details harder to hold. The smell of fuel faded first, then the sound of engines at full power. What stayed longer was the habit of scanning empty sky, the instinct to count aircraft automatically, to notice gaps where something should be. It followed some of them into civilian jobs, into quiet routines that had nothing to do with altitude or speed. There was no clean way to turn it off. Official histories condensed the war into movements and outcomes. Escort doctrine became a paragraph. The long hours were reduced to averages. Individual missions blurred together, indistinguishable, except for dates and losses. The restraint that defined the work did not translate well to narrative. It was easier to describe attacks than to explain why someone chose not to chase one. Recognition came unevenly, often late, sometimes after it could no longer matter to the people involved. Medals were authorized years after the flights they marked. Citations summarized careers in sentences that could not carry the weight of repetition. None of it changed the conditions under which the work had been done. It only confirmed that the records had not been wrong. What the war required from them was narrow and exacting. Stay with the bombers. Bring them home. Accept that success would look like nothing happening at all. That requirement did not bend to expectations, and it did not reward anyone for believing in it early. It only produced results when followed without deviation. By the time the contradictions were openly acknowledged, the moment that had forced them had already passed. The airfields were quiet. The formations no longer needed escort. The argument had ended without debate, settled by necessity, and recorded without comment. What remains is the trace of pressure applied until systems changed shape around it, not through defiance but through compliance so precise it left no room for denial. When there was no other option left, the work had already been done. In the years that followed, the silence around it hardened. Training manuals were updated. Integration became policy. The language adjusted itself until the past no longer required explanation. What had once been framed as an exception was absorbed into routine. New pilots entered cockpits without knowing how narrow the door had been before they arrived. Those who had flown the escort learned that the war did not end all at once. It ended in pieces. A letter answered or unanswered. An application approved after a delay that could not be explained. A chance offered years too late to matter. The distance between what had been proven and what was acknowledged remained uneven, measured differently by institutions than by individuals. When the story surfaced publicly, it often came simplified. Clean arcs replaced pressure. Moments replaced repetition. The risk was framed as courage rather than as calculation carried out under constraint. The work itself resisted that framing. It had never depended on belief. It depended on adherence. On staying when leaving would have been easier to justify. The bombers that returned didn't know who kept them intact. They only recorded that they landed. That was enough for the mission, and it had always been enough for the escort. There was no signal flare for restraint, no marker in the sky for discipline held over hours. Only the continued presence of aircraft that should have been lost. By the time the last documents were declassified and the last corrections entered into record, the conditions that had made the work necessary no longer existed. The contradiction had resolved itself quietly, not because it was argued down, but because it failed to survive contact with reality. What remains is not a moment, but a duration, days stacked into months, missions stacked into totals. Pressure applied without release until policy bent around fact. The result did not announce itself. It simply endured. And that endurance, unremarkable in appearance and decisive in effect, is why the escort that was never meant to fly is still there in the record, holding position long after the sky has emptied. Even as the sky emptied, the imprint of that work remained embedded in procedure. Escort doctrine did not vanish with the war. It settled into training, into assumptions about responsibility and coverage that no longer carried a footnote. New conflicts would be fought with different machines and different risks, but the expectation that protection did not abandon the vulnerable had already been fixed in place, quietly, without attribution. For the men who had flown those missions, the distance between then and later could not be bridged by documentation. Memory was not orderly. It returned without sequence. A formation tightening under flak, a fuel needle dropping faster than expected, the brief relief of seeing coastline again. None of it arrived with commentary. It did not need to. It had been lived at full weight. Public attention, when it came, often arrived misaligned with the reality of the work. It searched for moments of defiance, for visible confrontation. What it found instead was obedience under pressure, compliance that exposed a flaw simply by functioning. The record showed that nothing extraordinary had been required, only permission, and then the same demands placed on everyone else. The institution adapted as institutions do, by absorbing outcomes and discarding explanations. What could not be defended was removed. What worked was retained. The transition did not carry emotion, it carried efficiency. And once complete, it left little reason to revisit how close failure had come to being permanent. In the end, there was no final flight that closed the story, no ceremony that marked a conclusion. The work ended because the war ended, and the question it had answered stopped being asked. The escort returned, mission after mission, until there were no more missions to fly. What remains is a record of sustained pressure applied at exactly the point where assumption met reality. Not loud enough to be dramatic, not brief enough to be ignored. It did not overturn a system in a moment. It wore through it. And when the sky demanded protection with no room for error, the answer held its position, stayed in formation, and did not leave. After that, the story receded the way operational details always do. It did not disappear, it was filed. It became part of the background assumptions of an Air Force that preferred clean lines and forward motion. The contradiction that had once required justification no longer needed one. It had been resolved not by argument, but by use. Those who studied the records later found nothing dramatic in the language. No declaration of reversal, no admission of error, just orders issued, missions flown, results logged. The tone never shifted. The same forms were used before and after, as if the outcome had always been inevitable. Institutions are built to survive outcomes, not to reflect on them. For the men themselves, the distance between what was proven and what was said about it remained uneven. Some lived long enough to see the record revisited, their role named more clearly, their unit spoken of without qualification. Others did not. The timing mattered, but it was never corrected for. History does not adjust for delay. What can be measured still is the narrowness of the margin in which it happened. A war that needed precision more than spectacle. A task defined by staying rather than striking. A group placed under scrutiny that never lifted, even as evidence accumulated. Under those conditions, failure would have been permanent. Success had to be continuous. There is no sound attached to that success, no single image that contains it. Only the repeated return of aircraft that were expected not to. Only the absence of loss where loss had been routine. Only the quiet fact that when the system finally had no alternative, the work was already being done at the level required. That is how it ends. Not with a moment, but with continuity. With pressure maintained until it no longer needed to be applied. With the escort still in place when the sky cleared, holding formation, long after anyone expected it to be there at all. The distance between expectation and outcome never fully closed. It simply stopped being useful to point at. Once the data settled, once the missions ended, and the formations dissolved, the contradiction lost its urgency. What had been tested under pressure no longer required defense. It existed as fact, and facts, once established, tend to be left alone. The escort role faded into routine, then into doctrine, then into assumption. New pilots learned procedures without being told why they mattered so much. They were taught to stay, to cover, to accept that the measure of success might be an uneventful return. The origin of that discipline was not emphasized. It did not need to be. It had already been absorbed. For those who had been there, the end was less definitive. There was no clean separation between wartime flying and everything that followed. Some never entered a cockpit again. Others did, under conditions that suggested continuity while erasing context. The habits remained. The restraint remained. The memory of how thin the margin had been did not require reinforcement. What history eventually recorded was incomplete by design. It preferred summaries. It preferred outcomes. It avoided the sustained pressure that made those outcomes possible, because pressure does not fit easily into narrative. It cannot be condensed into a single act. It only reveals itself over time, through consistency. And consistency was the point. Mission after mission, with no allowance for exception, under scrutiny that never fully lifted, with consequences that were always immediate and final. The work did not escalate. It did not break pattern. It held. When the sky no longer needed escort, when formations no longer formed, when engines cooled for the last time, the absence of failure was already fixed in the record, not as a triumph, not as a correction, but as a baseline that could not be ignored. That is what remains, not a story that resolves neatly, but a line that holds steady through pressure until the pressure disappears. A presence maintained without recognition until recognition no longer matters. The escort stayed. The bombers returned. And the system, faced with evidence it could not discard, moved on as if it had always known. The long view does not sharpen the drama. It flattens it. What once felt urgent becomes procedural when seen from a distance, and the danger of that flattening is that it suggests inevitability. As if the outcome had been assured, as if the pressure had always been survivable. It was not. The margin was narrow enough that a handful of different decisions, a few different assignments, could have locked the system into its original assumptions permanently. The war did not ask whether those assumptions were fair. It asked only whether they worked. And when the question was reduced to that, stripped of theory and preference, the answer was delivered without emphasis. Escorts stayed with bombers. Bombers returned more often than before. The equation was complete. Everything else became secondary. What made the difference was not exceptional performance, measured in moments, but reliability measured in duration. The ability to repeat the same task under the same constraints without degradation. To fly into airspace that had already proven lethal and treat it as routine. To accept that the reward for doing it correctly would be the absence of attention. No deviation, no improvisation that could be praised later. Only adherence. This is why the work resisted easy retelling. It lacked the shape people look for. There was no sudden reversal, no dramatic confrontation that forced recognition. The pressure applied itself slowly, mission by mission, until the framework around it adjusted. By the time the adjustment was visible, it felt administrative rather than consequential. For years, the story existed mostly in fragments. A photograph of aircraft with painted tails. A footnote in a larger campaign. A statistic cited without explanation. It took time before the duration itself became the point, before someone noticed that the consistency had been maintained under conditions where consistency had not been expected. Even then, the recognition arrived filtered through distance. It spoke about barriers and breakthroughs, but rarely about the daily constraint of flying, knowing that any failure would be treated as confirmation rather than exception. Rarely about the weight of carrying not just a mission, but an argument that could never be made directly. The cockpit was not a place for argument. It was a place for execution. The discipline that made the work effective was indistinguishable from conformity. That, too, made it easy to overlook. Nothing about it looked like protest. Nothing about it challenged authority openly. It did not seek to prove a point. It sought to complete a task under conditions that made failure permanent. And because of that, the change it forced was difficult to attribute. Systems prefer causes they can name. This one had none that fit comfortably. There was no policy shift driven by belief, only a gradual removal of obstacles that could no longer justify themselves. The system did not admit error. It adapted. When later generations encountered the result, they often mistook it for progress that had always been underway. They saw the end state without seeing the compression that had produced it, the weeks without rest, the flights flown knowing that visibility would be low and scrutiny high, the knowledge that no allowance would be made for circumstance. What endures beyond commemoration and correction is the record of what happens when pressure is applied at exactly the point where assumption meets operational reality. Not once, but continuously. Not loudly, but persistently, until the assumption collapses under its own weight. There was no victory formation, no signal that the threshold had been crossed, just a point at which the escort was no longer described as unusual and then no longer described at all. It became standard, invisible, expected. That invisibility is the final measure of the work. To do something so precisely, for so long, under such constraint that it ceases to be remarked upon. To hold position until the need to explain why you are there disappears entirely. The sky does not remember. Airspace leaves no trace of who passed through it or under what conditions. Only the records remain, dry and insufficient, marking that when the war pressed hardest, when there was no room left for theory, the task was carried out exactly as required, and that was enough to change everything, without ever announcing that anything had changed at all. What follows after that is absence, the kind that only appears once something constant is removed. The escorts were no longer noted because they were no longer questioned. Their presence had been normalized so completely that it disappeared into expectation. And expectation, once set, is rarely traced back to its origin. The men themselves aged into a world that moved faster than their story. Aviation advanced, jets erased propellers, new wars rewrote priorities. The sky filled again with different machines, flown by pilots who had never been told that staying with the formation had once been controversial. They inherited the result without the tension that produced it. For some of the original pilots, recognition arrived as paperwork decades late, a ceremony in a room far from the noise and cold where the work had been done. A citation read aloud, summarizing years of pressure in a paragraph designed to fit an archive. It was not false. It was incomplete. It could not contain the accumulation of risk carried silently, flight after flight. Others never saw even that. Their names remained where they had always been, on mission rosters, in loss reports, in margins. History eventually found them, but history does not restore time. It only rearranges attention. The air war that had demanded such precision eventually became a case study. Analysts wrote about escort range, formation integrity, attrition curves. The conclusions were technical, detached, correct. They rarely addressed the human constraint of being told, implicitly and repeatedly, that failure would confirm a belief already held. That success would be treated as anomaly until it was no longer possible to ignore. That pressure shaped behavior more reliably than any speech could have. It enforced discipline. It narrowed choices. It turned restraint into instinct. In the cockpit, under oxygen masks and engine noise, there was no room to think about what the work meant. There was only the work itself, immediate and unforgiving. When the institutional memory finally shifted, it did so quietly, almost accidentally. A restriction lifted here, an assignment opened there, no announcement marked the change. The system simply moved forward, carrying with it procedures that no longer needed justification. The past was not revisited because the future no longer required the old limits. What remains after all the revisions and commemorations is still the same narrow fact. In a period when failure carried disproportionate consequence, the task was executed without deviation. Not once, but continuously, under scrutiny that never fully lifted, under conditions that offered no allowance for error. There is no need to elevate it beyond that. The work does not require symbolism. It does not benefit from emphasis. Its weight comes from duration, from the knowledge that it held when it did not have to be acknowledged, and that acknowledgement only followed once it could no longer be avoided. The sky closed behind those missions the way it always does, leaving no mark. But the structure that governed who could fly and how did not close in the same way. It had been altered by use, reshaped by consistency, and left in a form that could not be reversed without contradiction. That is the end state, not triumph, not vindication, just a system changed by sustained reality, and a record that shows how little noise it took to do it. By the final months of the war, the pressure narrowed instead of lifting. The number of missions left was finite now, and that made each one heavier. Every loss felt less absorbable. Every failure felt like something that would stand, permanent, because there would be no time to offset it later. The margin that had always been thin tightened further. Aircraft were worn past what manuals recommended. Engines had hours they were never meant to carry. Pilots flew machines they knew intimately, not because they trusted them, but because they understood their limits well enough to push right up against them without crossing. Maintenance crews stopped promising anything beyond flyable. That was enough. It had to be. The escorts were no longer an experiment, but the scrutiny did not disappear. It changed shape. Expectations rose without acknowledgement. Consistency was no longer surprising. It was required. Any deviation would no longer be dismissed as growing pains. It would stand alone. Routes grew shorter as targets collapsed, but resistance did not vanish. Flak still rose. Fighters still probed for weakness. Bombers still depended on the same thing they always had. Someone staying with them when turning away would have been safer. The escort held position, not because it was remarkable anymore, but because deviation at this stage would have undone everything that had accumulated. There was a sense, unspoken and unrecorded, that this was the closing window, that whatever remained unfinished would remain that way. The system would not revisit its assumptions again under these conditions. There would be no more chances to prove anything, only the final requirement to not fail now. Flights launched knowing there were only a handful left, knowing that losses here would be the last ones written down, knowing that the record would freeze soon, indifferent to context. The work became narrower, more exacting, stripped of everything except execution. Stay with the formation, bring them back, do not introduce uncertainty at the end. And in that narrowing space, with the end visible but not yet reached, the weight of the entire duration pressed into the present. Not as fear, not as anticipation, but as inevitability. This was the last stretch where anything could still break, the last moment where absence could turn into loss, the last point at which the outcome was not yet sealed. The final missions ended without signal or distinction. Engines shut down. Aircraft were parked in lines that would soon be broken apart. Crews dispersed quietly, carrying their gear, already being absorbed back into process. No one marked the moment when the pressure lifted because it did not feel like relief. It felt like termination. The record closed itself. Mission counts stopped increasing. Loss columns stopped changing. What had been accumulated under scrutiny was left exactly as it stood, fixed by the simple fact that there were no more opportunities to alter it. Nothing dramatic corrected the past. Nothing dramatic needed to. Bombers had returned, often enough to matter. Often enough that the argument embedded in their survival could no longer be avoided, even if it was never acknowledged aloud. The system adjusted around that reality without ceremony, without apology, without emphasis. When the sky finally emptied, it did not preserve memory. It never does. Only the outcome remained, a role executed precisely as ordered, under conditions that allowed no margin until it became ordinary, until it became invisible, until it no longer needed to be defended. That was the end, not a victory, not a reversal. Just the quiet fact that when the war demanded endurance over belief, the work held. And the system, confronted with results it could not dismiss, moved on as if it had always known.